Okay, hello everyone. This is our lecture on the respiratory system or respiratory systems, right? Because we're not only going to talk about the human respiratory system, but we will talk about respiratory systems in other organisms at the beginning of the chapter, right? And when we talk about sort of respiratory systems in other organisms, we'll talk about gas exchange surfaces just in general, um, talk about breathing and transport of gases, and then respiration and human health. So we'll end the lecture by talking about respiratory diseases. All right. So in terms of gas exchange surfaces, right? So, and this is also sort of the beginning to sort of define some terms here, okay? So respiration, right? We've all heard that term before, and basically it describes the sequence of events that results in gas exchange between the body cells, right, and the environment, okay? And so when we're talking about gas exchange, hopefully we're thinking of two particular gases, which are oxygen and carbon dioxide, okay? So if we talk about terrestrial vertebrates, right, respiration will include both three of these main things here: ventilation, external respiration, and internal respiration, right? So ventilation is essentially breathing, right? And that includes inspiration, right? Inhaling, and expiration, exhaling. Okay, so that's the sort of sort of functional inhaling and exhaling that you're doing, right, to take in that oxygen. When you're talking about external respiration and internal respiration, now you're talking about the gas exchange. Okay, so the ventilation is the breathing part of it, the respiration is the actual exchange of gases. So and we'll come back to external and internal respiration towards the end of the lecture as well. So external respiration is gas exchange between the air and the blood within the lungs. Okay, so when you inhale and you take that air into the lungs, you're taking in oxygen, you're also taking in other things as well. Once that oxygen gets into the lungs, it is then transferred to the blood, right? If you talk about internal respiration, we're talking about gas exchange between the blood and the tissue fluid. Okay, so now that oxygen that came in from the lungs is in the blood, right? And it's being carried around the blood. And we just talked about cardiovascular system, right? Um, it gets to the capillaries, right? Once that blood is in the capillaries, what's going to happen? That oxygen is going to leave the capillaries, right? Diffuse across the capillary membranes, right? And then essentially end up in the interstitial fluid or that tissue fluid, so that now the cells have access to that oxygen, okay? And so, and then also vice versa, those cells that are there would have released carbon dioxide into the tissue fluid. That carbon dioxide then would go back into the capillaries and into the blood and then go back to the lungs to be exhaled out. Okay, so again, we'll come back to these things later on. All right, but this is basically showing you what I just showed you, or what I just told you, duh. Okay, so external respiration, again, when you inhale, that oxygen goes into the lungs, makes it to the bloodstream, right? This is what I just told you guys. Then it gets to the capillaries, and then that oxygen is released into the tissue fluid. Those tissue cells now can pick that up. So internal respiration is the cells taking in those oxygen, right? Taking in the oxygen. Also, like I said, cells release carbon dioxide, right? That carbon dioxide gets, again, picked up by the capillaries or diffuses across the capillary wall, ends up into the blood, and then gets carried back, right, to the heart, to the lungs, to be exhaled out. Okay, so again, important to know external respiration versus internal respiration. Okay, so we talk about some of these surfaces where gas exchange takes place. I kind of mentioned this diffusion already. We should remember what diffusion is in general, and it's just the movement of molecules along their concentration gradient, right? Meaning they're going to move from high concentration to low, okay? And if those molecules are able just to diffuse across the membrane, they're just going to diffuse across the membrane, okay? And so when we think about the movement of both oxygen and carbon dioxide, right, moving from the lungs to the blood, or from the blood to the tissue fluid and then to the cells, it's all diffusion. It's just movement of those molecules along their concentration gradient. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are able to diffuse across the membrane on their own. That's something that we talked about, back in Bio 111. Okay, so there's just certain things that have to be in place in terms of the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, to be able to make it across the membrane, right, of the essentially of the lung into the blood, right? Those gas exchange regions have to be moist, they have to be thin, and they have to be large in relation to the body size, because you have to have lots of surface area for this to be happening. Okay. So it says effectiveness of diffusion is enhanced by many capillaries, right? Vascularization, as you might imagine, because again, you're getting where that exchange is happening is across that capillary membrane, right? Or across the cells that are in the capillaries. Remember, we talked about different types of epithelial cells, right? And if we talk about the types of cells that are in the lungs, right, and in the blood vessels, they are simple squamous epithelium. One layer, super squished and flat cells, because you have diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide that has to occur. If that layer of epithelial cells was so thick, there's no way that this would be able to happen, right? And that oxygen and that carbon dioxide wouldn't be able to move the way it needs to. Okay. Also, if we're talking about, it says delivery to cells is promoted by respiratory pigments like hemoglobin, meaning if we're talking about how is that oxygen and carbon dioxide transported through the through the body, through the blood, it's bound to a protein called hemoglobin. Okay. All right. All right, so a little bit more, and kind of we're sort of leading in to talk about some different types of animals here. So it says gases of air can dissolve in water. Okay, so if we're talking about oxygen, right, it will dissolve in water, and it's actually more difficult for animals to obtain oxygen from water than from air. Therefore, they're going to have specialized structures to be able to do that, right? So when saturated water contains a small fraction of the oxygen present in the same volume of air. So kind of think about as there sort of being less oxygen available in water than there would be in air, in that sort of same given volume. Water is much more dense than air, right? And so again, animals have to have some sort of adaptation to be able to extract that oxygen from water. Okay, so obviously we got lots of aquatic animals that are able to do that. Okay, they do expend a lot more energy to breathe than do terrestrial animals, due to these reasons that I just mentioned above, right? It's more difficult to get that oxygen out of the water. There's essentially less oxygen in water in any given volume. Okay, so aquatic animals have to work a lot harder to get that oxygen. Okay, so if we talk about different types of aquatic animals here, so hydra, planarians, we looked at these little guys in lab, right? They're tiny. Okay, so they're small animals, but they have a large surface area for their size. And so most of their oxygen, right, or taking in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide, that gas exchange is going to occur directly with the environment. Okay, I'm going to show you a picture of all these in a second. So they don't have lungs, they don't have specialized structures. It's because they're so small and they have this sort of large surface area compared to their body size that they're able to just exchange those gases directly with the water, essentially. Okay. Larger aquatic animals, as we know, will have gills. Okay. So these are sort of outgrowths of the body surface or of the pharynx. And that's where we're going to get this gas exchange that's occurring. Okay, so if you particularly look at the gills of bony fish, okay, those gills are extensions of the pharynx, and they have this sort of combined action of the mouth and those gill covers that's sort of the ventilation part, right? If we think about the inhaling and exhaling, right, or that mechanical part of breathing, okay. And they utilize something called a counter current exchange system. So it may take a little bit of time to sort of understand this. So you may have to kind of read it a couple times. Maybe you got to go back to your textbook and read it over. But basically, we're talking, this counter current exchange system has to do with transferring oxygen from the environment to their blood. Okay. So if you kind of compare the two terms here, right? So concurrent flow, right? Oxygen-rich water passing over the gills would flow in the same direction as oxygen-poor blood. So these two things are flowing in the same direction, the blood and the water. And basically, what the animal is trying to have happen here is basically that oxygen you need to get into the blood, right? And if they're flowing in the same direction, about 50% of oxygen could be extracted that way. Okay. However, in countercurrent, the two liquids are flowing in opposite directions. So it gives them more time to be sort of in contact, or they're not really in direct contact with each other, but there's more time that they're sort of exposed to each other. And actually, the oxygen extraction percentage is much higher at 80 or 90%. Okay. So in countercurrent flow, the blood, oxygen, basically oxygen poor blood that needs to get the oxygen from the water that's flowing. In countercurrent, they're going in opposite directions, okay? And that allows for a much larger percentage of oxygen to be extracted from the water. Okay, so this is our picture of our little hydra. And you can see that basically the way it's going to get oxygen and release carbon dioxide is just direct with the environment. Okay, so water can be siphoned in through sort of this, right, this cavity here, and then they can get oxygen and carbon dioxide from there, right? So lots of surface area, or from the outside as well. Okay, if we talk about earthworm, same thing, right? A lot of it's just basically coming in from the environment, okay? So oxygen coming in through essentially this sort of thin outer layer of that body surface, right? And then carbon dioxide going out. So there is no specialized respiratory structures in an earthworm. All right, now if we talk about, now we have some animals that are larger, right, that require specialized respiratory structures. Okay, so we talked about fish with the gills. We talked about that countercurrent flow. And you can see here, there's these, large capillary networks within the gills, just like you see capillary networks in the lung, right? And this is kind of showing you this here. And that's where that gas exchange is going to occur, okay? If we now look actually at insects, they have specialized structures called spiracles, okay? And in these spiracles is basically where the air is going to come in, and then they sort of further divide, right? So showing you sort of, it's showing this spiracle, right? And then they sort of further divide into these tracheoles, and essentially, again, the air is coming in and then branching out so that you can have sort of contact with those body cells and exchange, okay? The insect needs these specialized structures in order to get the oxygen to the cells, okay? So just doing exchange like this wouldn't be enough for those insects to actually get enough oxygen to their cells, okay? So they have these specialized structures here. They don't have lungs, but they sort of have, you think about our respiratory system, right? The trachea, and then all of the branching that occurs that eventually will terminate in these alveoli where the gas exchange actually occurs, okay? But you can see sort of similar branching in the insect sort of respiratory system, okay? But obviously not the same. So again, what we're gonna now focus mostly on is the mammalian or the human respiratory system, okay? So this is just showing you mammalian, very similar, obviously, to our human respiratory system, okay? So we're gonna talk more about this. All right. Yeah, so yeah, pretty much we're on to that just next, right? So this is just, I've already pretty much said this. When you then move on talking about terrestrial vertebrates, right? Mammals like the dog that I showed you, we have evolved lungs, okay? So these are outgrowths from the pharyngeal region. We sort of said those gills were sort of outgrowths of the pharynx. And so that's where these lungs are sort of coming from or derived from. Most amphibians, right, will respire still to some extent through the skin. Remember when we dissected the frog had lungs, right? However, those lungs are underdeveloped. So yes, they can use those lungs for some respiration, but a lot of the oxygen or gas exchange, oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide leaving, is actually still happening through the skin, right? Super important that the frog's skin is thin and moist to allow for this gas exchange to happen, okay? Lungs of birds and mammals are actually elaborately subdivided, okay? And so again, we'll talk about this, and we will particularly talk about birds and show how they are different, or their lungs are different than human lungs as well, okay? All right. So it says lungs must be kept from drying out, right? You still remember we said you need moist, thin surfaces. So it's important that the lungs are moist, right? Air is moistened as it moves through those passageways of the lungs. Okay. So if we talk about the sort of the respiratory structures, or particularly the lungs of humans, basically we're talking about, if we're talking about the respiratory system, right, we're talking about air coming in through the mouth and the nose, eventually making its way into the trachea and then moving down into the lungs. Okay, so again, these lungs are protected from drying out. Once that air moves through that upper respiratory system, it basically is filtered too. It's filtered to remove debris. Remember we said that those epithelial cells that line the trachea, right, that they're ciliated. I mentioned this, right? And so the cilia, those little hairs on those cells, can actually trap debris, right? And then those cells also produce mucus, so that you then, so it kind of sticks and helps it stick to the cilia. And then you're also able to kind of cough something up if you needed to, right? Or when you need to, okay? And so as the air is moving through there, it's sort of cleaned, right? It's also warmed and it's also moistened, okay? Super important that the air is warmed and moistened once it gets into the lungs, okay? So that air, when it's in the lungs, is at body temperature and it's saturated with water. Okay, so I kind of sort of said this, but if we sort of, again, talk about air coming in through the nose and the mouth, it'll pass through the pharynx, from the pharynx, through the glottis, and then move to the larynx and then the trachea, right? That's kind of what we were just talking about in the last slide. And that trachea actually has cartilage rings, okay? And it's super important, again, that the trachea, right, is held open. Obviously, if the trachea closes, then you're not going to be able to get air into your lungs. That's a problem, okay? And so the trachea, if you kind of actually even, let's see if I have a picture. Well, you can kind of see it here, right? You can see these cartilage rings here. And actually, when we do, we're not going to be able to do the fetal pig dissection. But that's one thing that I make sure you guys find that trachea and really feel it. And you can really feel those cartilage rings. And the structure of that trachea is very different than the esophagus, right? Because the esophagus doesn't have those cartilage rings, okay? All right, so anyway, right, it needs to be held open to facilitate the movement of that air. So if we talk about kind of when we swallow food, right? So important that we don't talk and eat at the same time, right? Why? Because if you're trying to do that, then sometimes this epiglottis might be open, and so then you're getting air is going in while you're talking, and that's when you can get something sort of entering in and going down towards the trachea when it's not supposed to, okay? And so obviously then you can choke. So normally when food is swallowed, the larynx rises, the glottis is closed by that epiglottis, right? And then basically the cover, the pharynx and the nasal passages are covered, okay? And then that food goes into the esophagus. So like I said, if you're trying to talk and eat at the same time, maybe the food enters into the pharynx when it's not supposed to, or liquid, right? When you're like, oh, it went down the wrong pipe. That's kind of what we're referring to. Okay, but that usually prompts a very quick coughing response to get, so it doesn't go any further, right? It's not going down into the trachea all the way. All right. Okay, so once air gets into the trachea, hopefully not food or anything else like that. Like I said, usually it's not going to make it that far. That trachea will then divide to form two primary bronchi, okay? Those two primary bronchi will enter the right and the left lungs, and then those bronchi will branch even further into bronchioles, okay? So again, you have the two primary bronchi that then have this further branching that occurs. Each bronchiole will terminate in an elongated space called an alveoli. At the alveoli is where the gas exchange actually occurs, okay? So if we look at this here, we basically follow this, right? And so we should know all of those organs and structures that I just mentioned in terms of air coming in through the nasal cavity and in through the mouth, right? And basically following into the pharynx, right? To the glottis, right? And remember, the epiglottis will cover that that pathway, if we're talking about, you know, when you're swallowing or when you're eating, you don't want food to go this way. But anyway, we're just following air here. Okay, so pharynx, right? Glottis, larynx, okay? Larynx here, right? It's kind of the throat, and then into the trachea, right? 2 primary bronchi, and then you can see all these bronchioles, all these other branches. And then at the very ends of those bronchioles, right? So here's your bronchiole. These are the alveoli. And so this is kind of cutting in. So you think of these alveoli as air sacs, right? And so the air's in there, lots and lots of surface area, and they are basically surrounded by this great vast sort of capillary, or not sort of, capillary network, right? And this is where gas exchange is occurring. Okay, so again, we need to know all the parts of these of the respiratory system. Okay, in fact, again, since we're not in lab doing the dissection and identifying these structures from the actual fetal pig, we need to be able to identify from figures like this. And so I definitely on the exam can include some of these figures. Okay, so just kind of to let you know, again, we're not going to do a separate lab. Like I said, we usually do this in the fetal pig where we're identifying respiratory structures and we're identifying some other structures as well and kind of doing that together. And then I usually, you know, give you a lab practical on identifying these structures, but we're going to kind of build this in. Okay, so this diagram I would be familiar with, right? If I asked you to identify the trachea from here versus identifying a bronchi, right, or a bronchiole, or the alveoli, we need to be able to do that, okay? So very important. What this picture is showing you here is just showing the lining of the trachea, and I kind of alluded or talked about that in the last slide, right? When we talked about these pseudo-stratified, ciliated, right? These are columnar epithelial cells, and you can see the cilia, and then you can see these goblet cells that will produce mucus. And basically, again, like I said, it can trap that debris, and then you can be able to get rid of that debris, okay? So we should be familiar with this diagram. I can definitely ask you to identify things, and I will on the exam, okay? All right. Now, if we actually talk about the breathing and sort of the mechanical aspect of respiration, right? Not really. We're calling this ventilation, okay? So inspiration says it uses negative pressure. It's the act of moving air into the lungs. So inspiration or inhalation, moving air into the lungs. The rib cage will move up and out, and the diaphragm will contract and move down, okay? So obviously, if the diaphragm moves down, that creates more space in the lungs because you want to fill those lungs with air, okay? So the thoracic cavity will expand, lung volume will increase, the pressure decreases in the thoracic cavity and in the lungs to less than atmospheric pressure, okay? Meaning when you expand them, there's more space there, so there's less pressure inside the lungs at that point than there is in the atmosphere, okay? And so that's why basically that air is forced into the lungs. So again, I'm not gonna harp on this, and I don't expect you guys to like know all about these pressure changes, but think about kind of the action or the ability of the air to fill the lungs has to do with a difference in pressure, okay? All right, if we talk about expiration or exhalation, this is the act of air moving or the act of moving air out of the lungs, okay? It says creation of positive pressure in the lungs because now the diaphragm is basically pushing up, making less space there, more pressure, and therefore the air is going to move out, right? So it says air flows out as a result of increased pressure in the thoracic cavity. So the pressure in the thoracic cavity is greater than the pressure in the atmosphere, and that's what's basically drawing that air out, okay? So rib cage moves down, diaphragm relaxes and moves up to its former position, okay? So and you should know this, during inspiration or inhalation, the diaphragm is contracted. So when the diaphragm contracts, that's when it moves down. Okay, during exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes. And remember, the diaphragm is a muscle, right? And so the diaphragm is relaxed and it moves up, again, creating less space, more pressure, and that forces the air out, okay? So it says here, no muscle contraction is required. Expiration is a passive process because the diaphragm is in its relaxed state during expiration. All right. So if we look at a picture of this is showing you inspiration, okay? So what's going to happen again, that diaphragm is going to contract. That's active, meaning, you know, neurons or motor neurons are stimulating this diaphragm to contract and move down. Okay, so again, on inhalation, diaphragm contracts, moves down, and now you have increased space here. Okay. During expiration, the diaphragm relaxes and moves up, and again, there's less space and more pressure, and air is forced out of the lungs. Okay. All right, and so this is just showing you kind of a analogy here. And actually, there are lots of models where they have this sort of balloon model to kind of show you how air is moving into and out of the lungs based on sort of pressure changes, right? So if you're talking about air moving into a container or air moving into a balloon, it's going to expand, right? They move outward. Okay. And then when it moves out, that air pressure increases and forces the air out, right? Again, think about a balloon that you then release and all of that air is pushed out. Okay. All right. Now, this is where we're going to talk about sort of a specialized type of ventilation that's used in birds. Okay. So it says for here, all terrestrial vertebrates, with the exception of birds, use something called a tidal ventilation mechanism, okay? So that means that air will move in and out of the lungs by the same route, okay? So again, this is all terrestrial vertebrates except for birds. So we will talk about birds in a second and how they differ. So tidal ventilation, air moves in and out by the same route. So if we think about humans, it's tidal ventilation, okay? Here it says lungs of amphibians, reptiles, and mammals do not completely empty or fill during each breathing cycle. So meaning there's, you're not extracting or getting rid of all of that air each time you exhale, right? So there's always kind of some that's in there. So there's sort of used air and new air is always sort of mixing with each other, right? Because it's the same way in as the same way out. And so that leads to a sort of decrease in gas exchange efficiency, right? I mean, if you could get all of the old air out all the time and only bring in the new, that would be more efficient, okay? So there's a loss of efficiency just based on this sort of mechanism, okay? So for birds, they again have an adaptation to make that gas exchange efficiency increase, right? So they use something called a one-way ventilation mechanism. And so here, I'll show you a picture in a second. So incoming air is carried past the lungs by the trachea, which takes it to these posterior air sacs, right? So it's kind of going into a separate spot here. Air passes forward through the lungs to a set of anterior air sacs, after which it's expelled. Okay, so there's sort of a holding chamber. So in that, because of the way it's set up, fresh air or new air will never mix with used or old air in the bird lungs. And then, like I said, that thus then increases gas exchange efficiency. And so if you think about birds, they're flying around all the time, requires lots of energy. They need to be able to have, be more efficient at taking in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. So if you look here, you can sort of see these modifications where they have these extra air sacs. So here during inhalation, right? Air enters into the posterior air sacs, okay? And then it says air exhalation begins, air enters the lung, okay? And then air will enter those anterior air sacs, and then they will exit from the anterior, okay? And so again, you never have the mixing of old air and new air because they sort of have an extra spot where it's sort of a holding chamber for things to be released, okay? So again, this increases the efficiency of gas exchange. So birds, or respiratory system in birds, is much more efficient than a human respiratory system, okay? So again, just understand that birds have a modified respiratory system that essentially gas exchange is more efficient because of these air sacs, these anterior and posterior air sacs, okay? You don't need to know, to explain every single detail here, but just understand that, again, there's sort of the inhaled air and the exhaled air, or the old air and the new air don't mix together, okay? So that's what this is saying here. Fresh air never mixes with that used air, okay? Because the old air that's being exhaled is basically moved to a different chamber before that new air is coming in, right? If you think about our respiratory system into and out of the lungs. In the birds, there's another place for that air that came in at first goes to another place before it's then exhaled out. Okay, so it never mixes. Okay, now if we talk a little bit more, so we talked about, you know, all of the organs and structures involved in breathing. We talked about the mechanical aspect of breathing, right? Inhalation and exhalation, or inspiration and expiration, right? We talked about gas exchange in general and gas exchange surfaces. But there's obviously also some, you know, other control of breathing. Okay, so it says normally adults have a breathing rate of 12 to 20 ventilations per minute. Okay, and there are breathing centers in the brain stem, right? The medulla oblongata, respiratory center, breathing centers that actually control this breathing rate, right? Or ventilation rate. Okay, so again, your breathing is not voluntary, right? You're not controlling that. It is an involuntary action, but it's controlled obviously by the brain, because we talked about that diaphragm contracting and relaxing. Okay, so there has to be a stimulus coming in from the nervous system to signal that diaphragm to contract and relax, right? That's breathing. Okay, if that diaphragm is not able to contract and relax, right, or not able to be stimulated by the nervous system, or not stimulated by the nervous system to relax, then forget it, right? You'll suffocate and die. Okay. So it says here, sends out impulses. So again, we're talking about the brain stem, sends out impulses to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, which are the muscles between the rib cage, so that inspiration can occur. Okay. When the respiratory center stops sending neuronal signals to the diaphragm and the rib cage, then expiration occurs. Okay, so you have that relaxation. It says it's also influenced by nervous and chemical inputs. Well, we're talking about chemical inputs right here. So after forced inhalation, stretch receptors in the alveoli initiate inhibitory nerve impulses that go to the respiratory center. So basically, there's sort of feedback that's coming from the actual lung, right? To tell the nervous system, all right, you need to stop sending impulses, because now essentially exhalation is going to occur. Okay, so bottom line is, again, we don't need to know the actual specifics of the complete nervous system control of the of respiration, essentially, but we should understand that there is nervous system input, right? And that the respiratory center is in the medulla oblongata, or the brain stem. Okay, so the brain stem is going to control breathing. If there is some sort of damage or some sort of issue in this area of the brain, obviously it's going to affect respiration. Okay, so that's sort of what we need to know. We need to understand that, you know, the nervous system or neurons are what's going to stimulate that diaphragm and those intercostal muscles to contract, and then you need to have inhibition, or have that stop being stimulated, for it to relax. Okay, so both are equally important. All right, so sort of just leave it at that. I mean, we will be covering nervous system and also muscular system, right? So we'll sort of come back to some of these, I don't know, sort of themes, talking about how the nervous system, you know, talks to muscles, or how does the nervous system tell a muscle to contract, right? What actually happens physiologically or biologically for a muscle to contract. Okay, so that's sort of, I guess, a little bit of a sort of preview of a couple of the upcoming chapters, and obviously a preview of something that's, you know, super important to understand in biology in general. Okay, it also says here, and so again, if you think about these stretch receptors, this is just a receptor detecting a change in the alveoli to then signal the nervous system to be inhibited. Okay, it also says that it's sensitive to hydrogen ions. Okay, so if there is too much, or if there's high levels of carbon dioxide, it actually causes an increase in hydrogen ions, which causes a decrease in pH. And there are chemoreceptors that will be able to detect that. And so if it detects that there are high levels of carbon dioxide, what would that then kick into play? An increase in respiration, right? And you start to breathe harder, and you increase that respiratory rate so that you can get more oxygen in and more carbon dioxide out. Okay, so you can kind of see how there's this interplay between the nervous system and the respiratory system. And like I said, this is going to be, we'll talk sort of more about the nervous system and how it affects other parts of the body when we cover that chapter. And then obviously that's something that you're going to be then talking about in lots of other courses as you move through your studies. Okay. All right, so this is showing you the respiratory center here. Again, I said it's in the brainstem, right? Showing you intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. Okay, we sort of saw all that before, but just so you know where this is, things are located. Okay. All right. We sort of already talked about this. Okay, we talked about this sort of difference in pressure, but now this is talking about more about specifically focusing on the movement of the gases, right? The movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we were talking about the difference in pressure in terms of mechanically how air moves into and out of the lungs, all right? Here now we're talking about sort of pressure and or think of it as sort of differences in concentration of the gases that will cause them to diffuse, right, from areas of high to low. So you can think of high partial pressure or higher concentration of oxygen, low partial pressure or lower concentrations of oxygen. Okay, so think about that, right? It's kind of the same. It's the same thing. Okay, so I kind of already said that, right? It says ventilation causes the alveoli to have a high partial pressure of oxygen and a lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide than the blood. Okay, and so again, that accounts for the exchange of gases in the lungs. Okay, so it's due to, again, differences in concentration, differences in partial pressure of those gases that dictates which way they're going to move. Okay, so we talked about this already, and you don't need to worry about all this sort of extra stuff that's going on here. Okay, I mentioned this in the beginning of the lecture, and I said we would mention it again. Again, don't worry about this too much. We just want to understand that when we're talking about external respiration, right here, we're talking about oxygen coming into the lungs, moving into the blood, right? And so again, the idea is that there's a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs and lower in the capillaries or in the blood vessels. Therefore, oxygen will diffuse into those capillaries, okay? And it can cross the plasma membranes and move directly into those capillaries. So there is no like active transport of oxygen or any sort of very complex mechanism. It moves by diffusion, okay? Here, because now the oxygen concentration or partial pressure is higher inside the capillary than it is outside, oxygen has the tendency to move out, okay? And vice versa for carbon dioxide. There's a higher partial pressure, or think about concentration of carbon dioxide outside than inside, so it has the tendency to move back in. Then it goes back, right, to the lungs, where again, you got a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide inside the blood vessel versus outside, and therefore has the tendency to move out, okay? So all this movement or exchange of gases has to do with differences in partial pressure, i.e. differences in concentration of those gases, all right? And we move on from there. So I would say this picture or this diagram, you really don't need to know details. It's just understanding the concept, again, of external respiration and internal respiration and why the gases move in the direction that they do, okay? All right. Other thing, we mentioned this too, is that hemoglobin is basically that protein that transports oxygen and carbon dioxide around in the blood. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are bound to hemoglobin, which is, there is free hemoglobin, but usually bound to the surface of the red blood vessels. Okay, so that's basically what the red blood vessels do. They carry oxygen around. They have a lot of surface area, and they're basically just made up of membranes and cytoskeleton, because their purpose is really to basically have hemoglobin bound to it so that they can bind oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so the last part of this is to talk about some disorders of the respiratory system. And so they're divided up in sort of upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. So if we talk about upper respiratory tract, common cold, right? Mild viral infections. So you should know examples of disorders of the respiratory system. You should also be able to distinguish between upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. And again, I forgot to remind you guys, everyone should have the review sheet out, or should have already had the review sheet out, and should be taking notes on that review sheet, either electronically or by hand, because you're going to have to be submitting that as well. Okay, so all of these things that I went through are on that review sheet. We need to add those details in. So just a reminder. All right, so if we talk about upper respiratory tract, common cold. We've all had a cold before. We probably all know what it's characterized by. And so it says antibiotics are ineffective for treatment. Why? Because they're viral infections. If we talk about strep throat, again, upper respiratory, this is pharyngitis, right? So, right, of the pharynx, the throat. And this is caused by bacteria, right? Streptococcus pyogenes. So this can be treated with antibiotics. Why? Because it's going to target a bacteria. It's not caused by a virus. Okay? Strep throat, severe sore throat, high fever, white patches on the tonsils. Do I have a picture? Yeah. So this is a picture. So like, right, you go to the doctor, you're like, oh, my throat's really hurting. When they look in your throat, if they see this, before they even do the strep test, they probably know that you have strep, right? A lot of times you're like, oh, wow, pretty sure you have strep. But usually they'll swab you anyway, just to make sure that that's the case, right? And it's not something else. And if it is, they're going to give you antibiotics to treat it, okay? All right. So again, for these disorders, we should know some of the sort of hallmark symptoms. And, you know, again, whether it's an upper respiratory tract disorder, also too, what it's caused by. Is it caused by a virus? Is it caused by a bacteria? All right. Now, if we talk about lower respiratory tract, these are disorders that are going to affect the trachea and the bronchi, okay? So choking, I talked about that before. That's why you don't want to talk and eat at the same time, okay? You can do the Heimlich maneuver to basically, you kind of put your thumb in right above the belly button, other hand, and then make a fist on that hand, and then the other hand goes on it, and you sort of push in and up to try to force that whatever's blocking that airway out, okay? We've all heard of bronchitis, and so bronchitis is inflammation of the bronchi. That's what it means, and you can have acute versus chronic bronchitis. And so acute means it's short term, right? Can be caused by an allergic reaction, also environmental toxins like cigarette smoke. With chronic bronchitis, again, it's just going to last longer, okay? And so it says here, airways will become inflamed and filled with mucus. Again, bronchitis means inflammation of those bronchi, but if it lasts for, you know, longer periods of time or is prolonged, it's going to be chronic. It's going to start to cause more issues, right? Asthma here, oops. These again, you get this sort of allergic, sometimes it's caused by an allergic response, but sometimes it could just be an irritant, okay? The smooth muscle in the bronchioles will sort of spasm, and again, that constricts the airways, okay? So here it's inflammation of the bronchi, right? Here in asthma, you get essentially the spasm of the smooth muscle in the bronchioles, okay? That then will cause you know, those airways to narrow and the feeling of not being able to breathe. All right, so more disorders affecting now particularly the lungs. So here, if we're talking about bronchitis and asthma, trachea and bronchioles, okay? But now if we're talking about getting into the lungs here, pneumonia, tuberculosis, those are going to be disorders that affect the lungs. Emphysema, pulmonary fibrosis, lung cancer, cystic fibrosis, all of these will affect the lungs, okay? Now, pneumonia can be caused by virus, can be caused by bacteria, can be caused by fungus, okay? Can be caused by a lot of things. And so the bronchi and the alveoli will fill with discharge. It could just be, you know, kind of, I don't know, it could be pus, can be fluid, can be any type of fluid, but essentially it interferes with gas exchange, okay? So remember, we said you have to have these really thin, you know, membranes and thin cells for gas exchange to occur. So if there's a layer of pus or other fluid in between there, well, how the heck is the oxygen in the lung going to get to the capillaries, right? It can't, because there's this extra layer of fluid that's there. And so obviously this is timely. If we talk about COVID, right? You know, one of the, you know, the serious sort of effects of it, if you're going to have this sort of serious form of this, is it leads to pneumonia, okay? And so anyway, I found this paper. I uploaded it to Moodle for you guys, and maybe we'll look at it together or whatever, but I just thought it might be sort of interesting if somebody was interested to look at it a little more closely, you can. But so basically, this is looking at pneumonia cases in Wuhan, China, a particular group at a particular hospital to talk about what symptoms they had, right? And all those and all those things. So it basically is a review or sort of case study. Maybe not, it's not really a single case study, but it's a clinical study of a group of patients there. Okay. So I believe, so 41 cases. Okay. So epidemiological, clinical, laboratory, and radiological characteristics, meaning like looking at, ultrasound of the lungs or CT scans of these patients to show you what some of the clinical, presentations are. Okay, so anyway, it's uploaded there. It might be a little bit, it's obviously beyond the scope of this class, but I thought it was interesting and timely. And again, remember that these are, it's viral. Okay, so this virus is causing the pneumonia, right? Pneumonia, again, can be caused by bacteria. A lot of times you probably, hear people, they have pneumonia, they got to get on really, really high doses or really strong antibiotic. Well, if the pneumonia is not caused by a bacteria, those antibiotics aren't going to help, right? Okay. Also, another disease, tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis is caused by bacteria, okay? And again, the name is named after the bacteria that causes it, right? Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So it was a major killer in the US before the middle of the 20th century. And so you get basically lung damage, reduced function. And so you actually see TB incidence higher in areas where HIV infection is common. Okay. And I'm sure anyone who probably even before you started school, right, you have to get a TB test anytime you start a new job. They always do this TB skin test where they can see if you have a reaction to that TB skin test. So it will determine if you were exposed to tuberculosis at one point or another. Okay, emphysema. Okay, alveoli become distended and the walls are damaged. Again, you can't exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide efficiently because of the damage in those alveoli walls. Okay, so it says contributes with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in smokers. So often you see basically COPD with emphysema. Okay, they sort of go hand in hand. Pulmonary fibrosis. This is where you basically get this fibrous connective tissue that builds up in the lungs. And again, if you don't have that thin, moist surface, gas exchange can occur, right? So if you have connective tissue that's building up in there, no gas exchange. Lung cancer, again, thickening, callousing of the cells lining the airways. Therefore, no gas exchange is going to be able to occur. You start to see, cancerous cells that then can, form tumors. Cystic fibrosis, another disorder of the respiratory system. Here, this is a genetic disease, right? So defective gene results in the accumulation of mucus secretion in the lungs. And so it is a genetic defect that affects a chloride channel. Okay, so that's what this is telling you here. And so basically, because of that chloride channel that's not functioning properly, you don't have enough water essentially there. And so the secretions become super sticky and the mucus is super thick, and therefore that interferes with breathing. Okay. So for treatments, you got to make sure you can clear that mucus from the airways. There are certain drugs that can help thin that mucus. And so right now they're looking to sort of gene therapy strategies for cystic fibrosis. But again, remember that it is purely a genetic disease. Okay. And we talked about cystic fibrosis a little bit when we did our genetics chapter, right? Again, it's a genetic disease, but obviously its symptom is, or it's affecting the respiratory system because of that defective chloride channel. All right. And so this picture basically shows you some of these diseases that we talked about, maybe every single one of them, right? And shows you where or what they're affecting within the respiratory system. Okay, so I like this diagram. I think it's super informative and shows you sort of the differences between the two. Now, some of the sort of clinical symptoms might be the same, right, for these diseases. However, their causes are much different. The causes and the location of where they're going to sort of manifest themselves is very different. Okay, so we should have an idea of where these things exist. And so, like I said, a lot of times I'll ask this question as sort of an essay question, you know, name 3 diseases of the respiratory system and explain what the symptoms are and what the cause is, right? So you really should know that just for probably 3 of these. You also, from, you know, multiple choice, I may say, you know, bronchitis, is it an upper respiratory disease or a lower respiratory disease? Okay. All right. And so this is just showing you here, if you talk about lung cancer and what a normal lung will look like, a lung with emphysema, right? And then a lung cancer where you can actually see the tumor. Pretty nasty stuff, right? And there's no reversing this. This damage cannot be reversed, right? If it gets to be that bad. All right. And that concludes our lecture on respiratory system.